Chapter 1. Invitations and Arrivals. The Morning Post at St. Mary Mead rarely brought anything of particular interest, especially to an elderly lady like Miss Jane Marple. Bills, perhaps, or correspondence from her nephew Raymond in London, or the occasional circular announcing some dreary church bazaar. Yet on this particular Tuesday in early June, as the golden light of summer streamed through the trellis of climbing roses outside her cottage window, Miss Marple found herself holding an envelope of cream-coloured paper, so fine that it seemed almost translucent. The elegant script that spelled out her name and address could only belong to one person. Lady Henrietta Westbrook, she murmured to herself, delicately slicing open the envelope with the small silver paper knife that had belonged to her mother. The garden party, I imagine, and indeed it was. The invitation, embossed with the Westbrook family crest, a falcon perched upon a gauntlet, requested the pleasure of her company at Westbrook Manor's annual summer garden party, to be held the following Saturday afternoon. Miss Marple placed the invitation carefully against the blue Wedgwood sugar bowl that sat at the centre of her breakfast table, and smiled. The garden party at Westbrook Manor was indisputably the social event of the season in St. Mary Mead, and despite her protestations that such grand affairs were really beyond her these days, Miss Marple found herself looking forward to it with quiet anticipation. The connection between Miss Marple and Lady Westbrook was an unusual one, a friendship that had blossomed after a rather delicate situation involving missing silver had been resolved through Miss Marple's astute observations. Lady Westbrook had been impressed by the elderly spinster's sharp mind and unassuming manner. "You see too much, Miss Marple," she had commented afterwards with grudging admiration, "but you have the good grace to be discreet about it." Since then, Miss Marple had been a regular invitee to various functions at the manor, though the garden party remained her favourite. It was later that same afternoon, while Miss Marple was meticulously deadheading her prized delphiniums, that she heard the crunch of gravel that signalled the arrival of a visitor. A moment later, Mrs. Dolly Bantry's cheerful voice called out from the garden gate, "Jane, are you at home to callers, or have those flowers got the whole of your attention?" Miss Marple straightened her back carefully, removing her gardening gloves as she turned to greet her old friend. "Dolly, how lovely! I was just about to put the kettle on. You've arrived at precisely the right moment." Over tea in the small sitting room, with the windows open to admit the heady scent of honeysuckle from the garden, Bantry's eyes gleamed with the light of fresh gossip. "I suppose you've received your invitation to Westbrook Manor?" she asked, helping herself to a second piece of seed cake. "This morning," Miss Marple confirmed. "It's always such a delightful affair, though I do find it rather taxing to stand about for hours these days." "Oh, but this year you won't want to miss it," Mrs. Bantry said with meaningful emphasis. "Haven't you heard? Charles Westbrook has returned." Miss Marple paused, her teacup halfway to her lips. "Charles Westbrook, Lady Henrietta's nephew? I understood he had settled permanently in South America. That's what everyone thought." Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly. "Left under something of a cloud, didn't he? Must be 15, no, nearly 20 years ago now. Never a word, never a letter from what I've heard. And now, suddenly he's back, and apparently quite the returning prodigal." Colonel Bantry heard it from Sir Richard himself at the golf club. Miss Marple set down her cup thoughtfully. "How interesting, and Lady Henrietta has received him back into the fold. That's the most surprising part." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "She's positively delighted. After all these years of saying she had no family left to speak of, suddenly she's telling everyone about my dear nephew Charles. Martha, that's my new maid, you know. Her sister works as one of the housemaids at the manor, and she says Lady Henrietta has had the east wing entirely redecorated for him. New furniture ordered from London. Everything. My dear Dolly," Miss Marple smiled indulgently, "you are remarkably well informed." "One does hear things," Mrs. Bantry admitted, not without pride. "But what do you make of it?" After such a long estrangement, Miss Marple considered the question, her faded blue eyes thoughtful. People do change as they grow older, Dolly. Perhaps Lady Henrietta feels the need for family connections more acutely now. She's not been in the best of health. I understand. Grayson has been calling at the manor twice weekly, Mrs. Bantry confirmed, though between ourselves I've always thought she rather enjoyed her episodes. They do ensure she remains the center of attention. Lady Henrietta has always appreciated being the focus of concern. Miss Marple agreed diplomatically. But I confess, the return of Charles Westbrook does intrigue me. I wonder what has brought him back after all this time. The question lingered in Miss Marple's mind over the following days as she carefully pressed her best summer dress and selected a hat that would provide adequate shade without being ostentatious. The weather, as if specially ordered for Lady Westbrook's benefit, remained gloriously fine, with clear blue skies and the sort of golden sunlight that seemed to illuminate the English countryside from within. Saturday dawned warm and bright, with just enough of a breeze to temper the heat. By 2 o'clock, Miss Marple was making her way along the elm-lined drive that led to Westbrook Manor. She had accepted Colonel and Mrs. Bantry's kind offer of a lift, though she preferred to walk the final portion of the journey. The gentle exercise was beneficial, she maintained, and it allowed her to arrive composed rather than flustered from being bundled out of the Bantry's motor car. Westbrook Manor stood as it had for the past 3 centuries, a handsome Jacobean house of honey-colored stone with mullioned windows that caught the afternoon light. Its gardens, which sprawled over nearly 5 acres, were considered among the finest in the county, a reputation due almost entirely to the efforts of Mrs. Lacey, the head gardener, whose expertise with exotic specimens was widely acknowledged. As Miss Marple approached the main lawn, she could see that a considerable number of guests had already arrived. Ladies in summer dresses of pastel hues drifted between islands of darker-suited gentlemen like butterflies among rocks. Waiters in black and white circulated with trays of champagne, while a string quartet played Debussy from a small pavilion erected beneath the copper beech. Miss Marple, how delightful that you could join us. The voice belonged to Lady Henrietta Westbrook herself, a tall, imperious woman of 70, whose bearing suggested she had never doubted her place in the world for a single moment. Despite her age, she stood remarkably straight, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style. All Mrs. Lacey's doing, I assure you, Lady Westbrook said with a dismissive wave. I merely express preferences. She creates the magic, but you must have a glass of champagne. Diana, my dear, would you? A young woman who had been hovering nearby stepped forward immediately. Miss Diana Pierce was Lady Westbrook's companion, a position she had occupied for the past 3 years. She was perhaps 30, with glossy dark hair cut in the fashionable bob that Miss Marple privately considered rather severe for English complexions. Miss Pierce wore a dress of mint green that emphasized her slender figure, and she performed her duties with a quiet efficiency that made her almost invisible at times. Of course, Lady Westbrook. Miss Marple, how nice to see you again. Miss Pierce signaled to a passing waiter, who presented a tray of champagne flutes. I believe Sir Richard was hoping to speak with you, Lady Westbrook. He's by the fountain with Mr. Hadley. Ah, Richard and his eternal financial discussions, Lady Westbrook sighed. I suppose I must. Miss Marple, do enjoy yourself. The roses are particularly fine this year, and there's a new topiary garden beyond the yew hedge that I think you'll appreciate. We'll speak again later. I have the most wonderful news to share with everyone this afternoon. As Lady Westbrook moved away, Miss Marple took the opportunity to observe the gathering with her customary careful attention. Sir Richard Westbrook, Lady Henrietta's brother-in-law, stood near the ornate Italian fountain deep in conversation with a slender, nervous-looking man whom Miss Marple recognized as Mr. Hadley, Lady Westbrook's solicitor. Sir Richard was a florid man in his 60s with the ruddy complexion of one who enjoys both the pleasures of the table and the hunting field. Mr. Hadley, by contrast, looked distinctly uncomfortable in the summer heat, his thin frame encased in a formal dark suit despite the weather, a bulging briefcase clutched in his hand like a shield. Nearer to the house, Dr. James Grayson chatted amiably with Colonel Bantry. The doctor was a handsome man of middle age with prematurely silver hair and the easy confidence of his profession. Miss Marple had always found him charming, if perhaps a trifle too aware of his own appeal. Her gaze drifted to where Mrs. Lacey, the head gardener, was directing two young men in the placement of a stone urn filled with a spectacular arrangement of lilies. Even at a social event, Mrs. Lacey maintained her professional demeanor, dressed not in party clothes but in a tailored linen suit of practical design, her grey-streaked hair secured in a simple knot. There was something commanding about her bearing. This was a woman who knew her worth and expected others to recognize it as well. It was as Miss Marple was mentally cataloguing these observations that a ripple of interest passed through the assembled guests. Conversations paused, heads turned, and there was a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere, the sort of change that occurs when someone of consequence enters a room, or in this case, a garden. A man was striding across the lawn toward Lady Westbrook. He was tall and well-built, perhaps 50, with the kind of tan that spoke of years spent in a climate far more generous with sunshine than England. His hair, once dark but now liberally streaked with grey, was brushed back from a high forehead, and he moved with the easy confidence of one accustomed to making an entrance. "Aunt Henrietta," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Forgive my slight tardiness." "London traffic, I'm afraid." Lady Westbrook turned, her face transforming with a smile of such genuine pleasure that it momentarily stripped away the years. "Charles, my dear boy," at last, she extended both hands to him, and he took them in his own, bending to kiss her cheek with practiced affection. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted that while his smile was charming, there was something in his eyes that didn't quite match its warmth, a calculation perhaps, or a wariness. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lady Westbrook announced, her voice carrying with the practiced authority of one who has commanded rooms far larger than this garden, "those of you who have not yet had the pleasure, may I present my nephew Charles Westbrook, recently returned to us after far too many years abroad. Charles, you remember Sir Richard, of course, and Dr. Grayson, and this is Miss Pierce, my companion." And the introductions continued, Charles Westbrook moving through the crowd with easy charm, shaking hands, offering compliments, playing the role of the returning prodigal with consummate skill. When he reached Miss Marple, he paused, studying her with a curiosity that suggested Lady Westbrook had spoken of her. "Miss Marple," he said, taking her hand briefly, "my aunt tells me you have an uncommon gift for observation. I shall have to be on my best behavior in your presence." "Oh, Mr. Westbrook," Miss Marple replied with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm afraid Lady Westbrook exaggerates my modest abilities. I'm merely an old woman who has lived long enough to recognize patterns in human behavior." Charles Westbrook held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, his eyes, a striking blue that must have broken hearts in his youth, narrowing slightly, as if reassessing her. Sometimes the most dangerous observers are those whom others underestimate, Miss Marple. Before she could respond, he had moved on, leaving her with the distinct impression that Charles Westbrook was a man who had spent many years calculating the effect of his words and actions on those around him. Lady Westbrook clapped her hands for attention, a gesture at once commanding and slightly theatrical. "My dear friends," she began, her voice carrying across the sunlit lawn, "I am so delighted you could all join us today. The weather has been most obliging, the gardens are at their peak, and I have wonderful news to share with you all later this afternoon. But for now, please enjoy the champagne, the music, and most especially, the company." As the guests dispersed across the lawns and into the formal gardens, Miss Marple found herself watching Charles Westbrook as he moved among the guests, noting how Sir Richard's expression tightened whenever his nephew approached, how Miss Pierce seemed unusually attentive to the prodigal's empty champagne glass, and how Dr. Grayson observed it all with the detached interest of a man accustomed to diagnosing hidden conditions. Quite the dramatic return, wouldn't you say? Mrs. Bantry had appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, her eyes bright with speculation, rather like something from a novel. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, watching as Charles Westbrook raised his freshly filled champagne glass in salute to his aunt, his smile brilliant in the summer sunshine, rather too much like a novel perhaps. "In my experience, Dolly, real life rarely arranges its entrances and exits with such perfect timing, unless, of course, someone is stage managing events." "What an intriguing thought," Mrs. Bantry replied. "And who do you suppose is directing this particular drama?" Miss Marple's gaze returned to Charles Westbrook, noting the subtle but unmistakable calculation in his manner. "That, my dear, is what I find myself wondering, and, more importantly, what final scene they have in mind for their production." Chapter 2, Shadows in the Garden. Miss Marple found herself seated on a white, wrought-iron bench beneath the spreading branches of a copper beech. From this vantage point, she had an excellent view of the proceedings while giving her elderly limbs a much into the various garden rooms, for which Westbrook Manor was justly famous. Miss Marple observed the ebb and flow of social interactions with the practiced eye of one who has spent a lifetime studying human nature in the confined laboratory of village life. "Are you quite comfortable, Miss Marple? Not too warm in the sun?" Miss Pierce had materialized beside her, carrying a small silver tray with canapes. The young woman's attention to detail was commendable, though Miss Marple noted a certain tension around her eyes that belied her composed demeanor. "Thank you, my dear. The shade is most pleasant here, and the view quite instructive." Miss Pierce's eyebrows rose slightly. "Instructive? I suppose the rose garden is particularly fine this year." "Oh yes," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "although I was referring more to the human specimens than the botanical ones. So interesting to observe people when they believe themselves unobserved. Don't you think a flicker of something, alarm?" crossed Miss Pierce's face before she recovered. "Lady Westbrook values your discretion as much as your observational skills," she said with a slight smile. "If you'll excuse me, I must ensure Charles has everything he requires." Miss Marple watched as the young woman moved purposefully across the lawn to where Charles Westbrook stood, near the large stone fountain, deep in conversation with his uncle by marriage. Even from this distance, the rigid set of Sir Richard's shoulders suggested the exchange was not entirely amicable. As Miss Pierce approached with a fresh glass of champagne for Charles, the conversation between the two men abruptly ceased. Sir Richard nodded curtly and moved away, making a direct line toward the rhododendron walk where Mr. Hadley, the solicitor, stood examining a particularly fine bloom with exaggerated interest. The moment Sir Richard reached him, both men disappeared behind the dense shrubbery, clearly seeking privacy for their discussion. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself. "Very curious indeed." Her attention was diverted by movement near the main garden path, where Mrs. Lacey was directing two gardeners, in what appeared to be a rearrangement of several stone ornaments. A decorative urn was being moved some 6 inches to the left, while a stone nymph was turned slightly to face a different direction. Miss Marple frowned, puzzled by this seemingly unnecessary adjustment of garden elements that had presumably been placed with careful consideration initially. More curious still was that Mrs. Lacey kept glancing toward the terrace where Lady Westbrook was holding court, as if ensuring her actions went unnoticed by her employer. The gardener's movements were precise and deliberate, suggesting to Miss Marple's mind something more significant than mere aesthetic adjustment. "You have that look, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, settling herself on the bench beside Miss Marple. The one that means you're piecing together a particularly intricate jigsaw. Miss Marple smiled. I'm simply enjoying the afternoon, Dolly, though I must say, there are some rather odd currents beneath the surface of this particular gathering. Charles Westbrook's return has certainly stirred the waters. Mrs. Bantry agreed. Did you notice how Diana Pierce has scarcely let him out of her sight? One might almost think she was ensuring he didn't speak privately with certain guests, or perhaps ensuring that his champagne glass is never empty, Miss Marple observed, as Miss Pierce once again approached Charles with a fresh glass. That's the third she's personally delivered to him in the past hour. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Grayson, looking cool and composed despite the warmth of the afternoon. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, he greeted them with a slight bow. I trust you're both enjoying Lady Westbrook's hospitality. Immensely, Mrs. Bantry replied, though Jane was just remarking on some curious undercurrents. Undercurrents at a Westbrook garden party? Surely not. Dr. Grayson's tone was light, but Miss Marple caught the sharp glance he directed toward where Charles stood by the fountain. Though I will admit, the prodigal's return has created a certain tension. I understand you've just returned from Switzerland, Dr. Grayson, Miss Marple said, deliberately changing the subject. A medical conference, was it? Indeed, very illuminating. The latest advances in cardiology and some fascinating developments in pharmaceutical treatments. He hesitated, then added in a lower tone, Lady Westbrook has been most interested in my findings. She's been making significant changes to her medication regimen. Is that wise at her age? Mrs. Bantry asked bluntly. Dr. Grayson's smile was professionally reassuring. All under careful supervision, of course. Lady Westbrook has been talking quite seriously about putting her affairs in order, her phrase, not mine. Between ourselves, I believe today's announcement may be related. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing statement, their attention was drawn to a commotion near the terrace. Charles Westbrook, glass in hand, had mounted the shallow steps and was addressing the scattered guests in a carrying voice. My friends, both old acquaintances and new, I'd like to propose a toast to Westbrook Manor and its glorious future. His gaze swept the gathering, lingering momentarily on Sir Richard's thunderous expression. Some of you may know that the Westbrook fortunes have seen better days, but I assure you, once I assume my rightful position, the family's prosperity will be fully restored. An uncomfortable silence followed this proclamation. Lady Westbrook stepped forward quickly, her social smile firmly in place, though her hands betrayed her agitation as they plucked nervously at her pearl necklace. Charles, dear, perhaps we should move to the terrace for refreshments before my little announcement. The sun is becoming quite intense. Charles turned to his aunt with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Of course, Aunt Henrietta, I'm simply expressing my enthusiasm for the family's future. He raised his glass higher, to new beginnings and restored fortunes, as he brought the glass to his lips and took a substantial drink. Miss Marple noticed Miss Pierce half rising from her seat, her expression strangely intent. At the same moment, Mrs. Lacey emerged from behind a topiary, her eyes fixed on the terrace. The next few seconds seemed to unfold with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Charles Westbrook's face contorted suddenly, his free hand clutching at his throat. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone terrace in a spray of crystal and golden liquid. I can't, he gasped, his voice a strangled whisper. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Charles collapsed onto the manicured lawn, his body convulsing violently. Stand back, please, Dr. Grayson was already in motion, rushing toward the fallen man. Give him air. Screams erupted from several ladies, including Lady Westbrook, who swayed dangerously before being supported by Miss Pierce. Sir Richard emerged from the rhododendron walk, his face ashen, while Mr. Hadley clutched his briefcase to his chest as if it contained something precious or dangerous. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her eyes missed nothing. Not the swift efficiency with which Dr. Grayson rolled Charles onto his side, nor the way Mrs. Lacey melted back behind the topiary, nor the curious expression that flitted across Miss Pierce's face, some meticulously planned. Grayson frantically attempted resuscitation, his efforts growing increasingly desperate. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the stone ornaments Mrs. Lacey had so carefully repositioned. From where she sat, they formed an almost perfect line of sight between the greenhouse, partially hidden behind a yew hedge, and the terrace where Charles Westbrook now lay motionless, beyond all human aid. Chapter 3. Death Amid the Dahlias. Chaos descended upon Westbrook Manor's elegant garden party with the swiftness of a summer thunderstorm. Ladies who moments before had been commenting on the excellence of the canapés now pressed handkerchiefs to their lips in horror. Gentlemen who had been discussing cricket scores and stock prices clustered in shocked groups, their voices hushed yet urgent. In the epicenter of this storm of human emotion lay Charles Westbrook, motionless upon the immaculate lawn. Grayson knelt beside him, his medical bag open, though his actions had transformed from the urgent ministrations of treatment to the resigned confirmation of death. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he announced, rising slowly to his feet. "He's gone." A wail emerged from Lady Westbrook, who had been supported to a nearby garden chair by the ever-attentive Miss Pierce. "Charles, my dear boy? Oh, it cannot be." Sir Richard stepped forward, his florid face now drained of color. "Are you certain, doctor? Perhaps if we were to get him to hospital." "Death was almost instantaneous, doctor," Grayson replied, his professional demeanor firmly in place. "From the symptoms, the clutching at the throat, the rapid collapse, I would suggest some form of poisoning, though I cannot be certain without proper examination." At the word poisoning, a ripple of fresh alarm spread through the assembled guests. Eyes darted to half-empty champagne glasses, now viewed with sudden suspicion. "The champagne must be secured immediately," declared a firm voice from the back of the gathering. A tall, lean man in a neatly pressed suit stepped forward, producing a small identification card. "Inspector Craddock, County Police. I was attending the garden party at Lady Westbrook's kind invitation, though in a private capacity. Nevertheless, until appropriate authorities arrive, I must ask that everyone remain where they are, and that all beverages be left untouched." Miss Marple, still seated on her bench beneath the copper beech, observed the swift transformation of a social occasion into a police investigation. With calm interest, she noted how quickly Inspector Craddock took control, how efficiently he had waiters collect the remaining champagne bottles and glasses, and how he quietly arranged for the body to be shielded from view with several garden parasols, a considerate gesture toward both the deceased's dignity and the sensibilities of the more delicate guests. Lady Westbrook was assisted into the house by Miss Pierce, and Dr. Grayson, her grief punctuated by statements that seemed to Miss Marple to contain something beyond the shock of sudden death. A curious mixture of regret and thwarted purpose. "He never knew," she kept saying as she was led away. "He never heard my announcement, after all these years, to have him return only to— Oh, it's too cruel." As she passed near Miss Marple's bench, Lady Westbrook suddenly gripped the elderly woman's hand with surprising strength. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice momentarily clear and urgent, "I was going to announce it today. Charles was to be reinstated as my heir. All these years of estrangement ended at last. And now," her voice broke, and Dr. Grayson gently guided her onward toward the house, exchanging a significant glance with Miss Marple as he did so. The guests were gradually escorted to the grand drawing-room to await preliminary questioning, the garden party's festive atmosphere now utterly dispelled. Miss Marple found herself among the last to be ushered inside, partly due to her unobtrusive position, and partly because Inspector Craddock deliberately approached her as the crowd thinned. "Miss Marple," he said with a respectful nod. "We've met before, I believe." the Gossington Hall affair. Indeed, Inspector, you have an excellent memory, and you have excellent observational skills if I recall correctly. I wonder if you noticed anything unusual before this tragic event, anything that might not seem significant to others, but struck you as out of place. Miss Marple considered for a moment, her faded blue eyes thoughtful. There were several things, Inspector. Mrs. Lacey, the head gardener, was rearranging certain ornamental pieces shortly before the incident, stone nymphs and urns along the garden path. It seemed an odd thing to do during a party, and she appeared most concerned that Lady Westbrook shouldn't notice her actions. Inspector Craddock nodded, making a brief note in a small notebook. Anything else? Miss Pierce, Lady Westbrook's companion, was particularly attentive to Mr. Charles Westbrook today. She personally brought him several glasses of champagne, including, I believe, the final one. That's most helpful, the inspector said. I'll need to speak with Miss Pierce, of course, and Mrs. Lacey. There is one other thing, Inspector, Miss Marple added. The preliminary examination suggests poison, and Dr. Grayson mentioned that the symptoms indicated something fast-acting. I couldn't help but notice earlier in the week, when taking my daily constitutional past the manor grounds, that the greenhouse contains several plants that would be quite foreign to English gardens, South American specimens, I believe. Mrs. Lacey is known for her expertise with exotic flora. The inspector's eyebrows rose slightly. An excellent point, Miss Marple. I shall have the greenhouse examined most carefully. He hesitated, then added in a lower tone, between ourselves, preliminary testing of the remaining liquid in Mr. Westbrook's broken glass suggests that it was his glass alone that was contaminated. Someone targeted him specifically. As the late afternoon progressed into evening, the beautiful gardens now illuminated by police torches, rather than the paper lanterns that had been intended for the evening's continuation of festivities. Various facts emerged through the careful questioning of those present. Sir Richard Westbrook, when interviewed in the library, reluctantly disclosed information that cast the day's events in a new light. The estate is not in the financial condition that my sister-in-law believes, he admitted to Inspector Craddock, with Miss Marple present at the inspector's specific request. I've been making certain investments, somewhat speculative perhaps, to maintain our standard of living. Lady Westbrook has no head for business matters, and has always left such things to me. Charles's return complicated matters considerably. He was asking questions about the estate finances that were, frankly, inconvenient, and if Charles had been reinstated as Lady Westbrook's heir, as she intended to announce today, Inspector Craddock asked. Sir Richard's expression darkened. He would have had access to the accounts eventually, and he could be quite ruthless when it came to business matters. I feared he might misinterpret some of my financial decisions. In another room, Mr. Hadley confirmed that he had indeed brought Lady Westbrook's newly revised will to the garden party, at her specific request. Lady Westbrook had previously arranged for her considerable fortune to be distributed among various charitable organizations, the solicitor explained, his thin fingers nervously adjusting his spectacles. The documents I brought today would have reversed that disease with certain specific bequests to household staff and other individuals, remains in effect. These other individuals, would that include Dr. Grayson by any chance? Miss Marple inquired gently. Mr. Hadley looked startled. I really shouldn't, but yes, Doctor. Grayson is named as a beneficiary. Lady Westbrook has always been most appreciative of his medical attention. As twilight deepened into night, Miss Marple made her way carefully across the darkened lawn, accompanied by Inspector Craddock. They were heading toward the spot where Charles Westbrook had collapsed, now cordoned off with police tape. I wanted to examine the area before it's disturbed further, the inspector explained. The forensic team has finished their preliminary work. As they approached, Miss Marple suddenly stopped, her attention caught by something half hidden in the grass near the edge of the cordoned area. Inspector, she said quietly, there appears to be a gardening glove just there near that dahlia bed. Craddock carefully retrieved the item using his handkerchief. It was indeed a gardening glove, well-worn leather, with a distinctive stain on the palm and fingers. Soil, Miss Marple observed, but not the same as one would find in this flower bed. See how the color differs. I believe that soil comes from the specialized mixtures Mrs. Lacey uses for her exotic plants in the greenhouse. Inspector Craddock looked at Miss Marple with newfound respect. You've given me several threads to follow, Miss Marple. It seems we have a complex tapestry to unravel in the days ahead. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed as they turned back toward the house, now ablaze with lights as the investigation continued into the night. And I suspect we shall find that this tragic death has roots that extend far deeper than today's garden party. In my experience, Inspector, murder is rarely a sudden impulse. It grows slowly, nurtured by old grievances and secret desires, much like the deadly plants in Mrs. Lacey's greenhouse. Miss Marple, who had slept poorly, her mind turning over the events of the previous day with methodical precision, arrived at the imposing front door shortly after 10 o'clock. She had come ostensibly to pay a condolence call on Lady Westbrook, an entirely proper social gesture that would surprise no one. The door was opened by Simmons, the elderly butler, whose impassive face betrayed only the slightest evidence of the household's disruption. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Her ladyship is resting under sedation, I'm afraid. Dr. Grayson's orders." "How very understandable." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Such a terrible shock. Perhaps I might leave my card." Miss Pierce suggested that any callers be shown to the morning room. Simmons replied. She thought Lady Westbrook might feel up to receiving visitors later in the day. "If you wouldn't mind waiting." The morning room, a charming space overlooking the east garden, was empty when Miss Marple was shown in, giving her a few precious moments alone. She moved immediately to the writing desk by the window, noting the heavy cream stationery embossed with the Westbrook crest, identical to the invitation she had received. A leather-bound address book lay open, and Miss Marple glanced at it briefly, her sharp eyes catching an address in Rio de Janeiro, before footsteps in the corridor prompted her to move discreetly away. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call." Miss Pierce entered, carrying a silver tea tray which she set down on the low table between the comfortable armchairs. "Lady Westbrook is still quite overcome, I'm afraid. Dr. Grayson administered a sedative late last night." "A most distressing situation for everyone," Miss Marple said gently, accepting the teacup offered to her, especially coming at what should have been such a joyful reunion. Miss Pierce's hands trembled slightly as she poured her own tea. Lady Westbrook had been so looking forward to announcing Charles's reinstatement as her heir. She had quite transformed since his return. "His return was rather sudden, was it not?" Miss Marple inquired. After so many years abroad, a shadow crossed Miss Pierce's face. "It seems so to most people." "Yes, but in fact," she hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "Charles had visited Lady Westbrook privately 3 weeks ago. Their reconciliation had already taken place. Yesterday was to be its public declaration." "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured, and yet very few people knew of this earlier visit. It was kept quite secret. Lady Westbrook wanted to prepare everything properly before making it known. Only myself, Simmons and Mrs. Timmins the housekeeper were aware. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, followed by the entrance of a stout, capable-looking woman, whom Miss Marple recognized as Mrs. Timmins. "Excuse me, Miss Pierce, but Inspector Craddock has returned and wishes to speak with Lady Westbrook. I've told him she's resting, but he's most insistent." Miss Pierce rose immediately. "I'll speak with him. Please stay and enjoy your tea, Miss Marple. I shan't be long." As soon as Miss Pierce had departed, Mrs. Timmins lingered, casting a meaningful glance at Miss Marple. "Terrible business, isn't it, madam?" "Poor Mr. Charles. Most tragic," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand he had visited some weeks before the garden party." Mrs. Timmins nodded, moving closer and lowering her voice. That he did, arrived without warning one evening, he did. Nearly gave her ladyship a turn, but once they'd talked privately. Oh, the change in her, like she'd grown 10 years younger overnight. They reconciled their differences then. Whatever had kept them apart all these years seemed to melt away. Her ladyship was happier than I've seen her in an age. Started making all sorts of plans, having the East Wing redecorated, ordering new furniture from London. Said it was time to look to the future, instead of living in the past. And how did the household respond to this development? Miss Marple inquired, sipping her tea. Mrs. Timmins' round face grew thoughtful. Mixed feelings, you might say. Miss Pearce seemed pleased for her ladyship's sake. Sir Richard, when he was informed, looked like he'd swallowed a lemon whole, and Dr. Grayson, well, he just nodded and said change could be beneficial for Lady Westbrook's constitution. And Mrs. Lacey, the head gardener? A curious expression flitted across Mrs. Timmins' face. Now that's a queer thing. When Mr. Charles took a tour of the grounds that first day, he and Mrs. Lacey came face to face by the Italian garden. The look that passed between them, like they'd seen ghosts, both of them. Later that day, I found Mrs. Lacey in the potting shed, and I could swear she'd been crying, though she'd deny it to her dying day, proud woman that she is. Before Miss Marple could pursue this intriguing information, they heard footsteps approaching. Mrs. Timmins straightened a cushion unnecessarily. I'd best be getting on with my duties. Good day to you, Miss Marple. After finishing her tea and leaving appropriate messages of condolence for Lady Westbrook, Miss Marple made her way out through the garden, rather than the front entrance. This route would take her past the greenhouse, a detour that was entirely intentional. The greenhouse was a substantial Victorian structure of iron and glass, filled with exotic specimens from around the world, Lady Westbrook's pride and Mrs. Lacey's domain. As Miss Marple approached, she saw the head. Miss Marple, I didn't realize you were visiting today. I called to pay my respects to Lady Westbrook. Such a dreadful shock for her. Miss Marple moved closer, examining the plant with interest. South American, isn't it? I believe my nephew Raymond mentioned similar flora in his letters from Brazil. A flicker of unease crossed Mrs. Lacey's face. Yes, from the Amazon region. It requires very specific conditions, particular soil composition, precise humidity levels. Fascinating. I'm something of an amateur gardener myself, though my expertise lies with more commonplace English varieties. Is it difficult to maintain such exotic specimens in our climate? It requires knowledge and dedication, Mrs. Lacey replied, her tone softening slightly when speaking of her plants. The greenhouse allows us to regulate conditions, of course. I imagine some of these plants have unusual properties, Miss Marple remarked innocently. Medicinal uses, perhaps, or even toxic effects. Mrs. Lacey's expression closed immediately. Many plants can be dangerous if mishandled. That's why the greenhouse is kept locked when I'm not present. She shifted the pot in her arms. If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, this specimen needs repotting. Of course, though before you go, I understand you were previously acquainted with Mr. Charles Westbrook. Before his time abroad, the pot slipped slightly in Mrs. Lacey's grasp, though she recovered quickly. That was many years ago. If you're suggesting, I'm suggesting nothing, Mrs. Lacey, Miss Marple said gently, merely trying to understand the connections between those present yesterday. Inspector Craddock will undoubtedly be asking similar questions. As if summoned by her words, they both caught sight of Inspector Craddock, approaching across the lawn accompanied by a uniformed constable. Mrs. Lacey's lips tightened. The inspector has already questioned me at length. Now, if you'll excuse me. Miss Marple watched thoughtfully as the head gardener strode away, her back rigid with tension. She turned to greet Inspector Craddock, who raised his hat politely. Miss Marple, I'm beginning to think we're following the same trail. Good morning, Inspector. I was simply admiring the greenhouse collection. Such unusual specimens. Indeed, the autopsy results have confirmed death by poisoning, a rare plant toxin that affects the respiratory system almost immediately. And as you suggested yesterday, the champagne glass had been wiped clean of fingerprints before being given to Charles Westbrook. Most suggestive, Miss Marple nodded. Have you had an opportunity to speak with the household staff? They often observe much more than their employers realize. We've been conducting interviews since dawn, Craddock confirmed, and building quite an interesting picture. It seems several people had reason to be concerned about Charles Westbrook's return to favor. Sir Richard's financial management would have come under scrutiny, Miss Marple suggested. Precisely. We've discovered some highly questionable investments made with Lady Westbrook's capital, all signed with her authorization, but she appears to have had little understanding of what she was approving. And Miss Pierce's position as companion would likely have become redundant had Charles taken up permanent residence. Inspector Craddock raised an eyebrow. You've deduced much already. Yes, Miss Pierce has been companion to Lady Westbrook for 3 years, with a most generous salary and the promise of a significant bequest in the will, a bequest that the new will would have eliminated. Then there's Dr. Grayson, who I understand was named as a beneficiary in the original will. A substantial beneficiary, Craddock nodded, ostensibly in recognition of his years of medical care, and finally, he hesitated. Mrs. Lacey had some previous connection to Charles Westbrook. Miss Marple completed his thought. From their youth, perhaps? The inspector looked impressed. You are well informed, Miss Marple. According to one of the gardening staff, Mrs. Lacey and Charles Westbrook had been briefly engaged many years ago, before he suddenly departed for South America. The engagement was broken in rather humiliating circumstances. He apparently abandoned her for a wealthier prospect who could finance his business ventures abroad. How very distressing for her, Miss Marple murmured, and then to find him returning triumphantly, all these years later. They had been walking slowly back toward the main garden as they spoke. Miss Marple paused, her gaze falling on the stone ornaments along the path, the nymphs and urns that Mrs. Lacey had been so carefully rearranging before the tragedy. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, would you indulge an old woman's curiosity? Might we retrace the exact spot where Mr. Westbrook collapsed yesterday? Together they walked to the area on the lawn near the terrace, still marked by police tape. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, then turned slowly, aligning herself with the ornamental path. How very interesting, she murmured. From this position, these stone figures create a perfect line of sight from here to the greenhouse, almost like markers, Craddock frowned, or signals, Miss Marple suggested, arranged so that someone working in the greenhouse could see exactly when to act, despite not being able to directly observe the terrace. The inspector's expression sharpened. You believe the rearrangement of these garden ornaments was part of the murder plan? It would explain why Mrs. Lacey was adjusting them during the party. Something that struck me as most peculiar at the time. Miss Marple bent carefully and plucked something from beside one of the stone urns, a crushed petal of an unusual waxy texture. I believe you'll find this matches one of the exotic specimens in the greenhouse, Inspector. The same plant, perhaps, that provided the toxin. Inspector Craddock took the petal, examining it closely. Miss Marple, I believe you've given us a most promising lead. This case becomes more complex by the hour. Murder often does, Inspector, Miss Marple replied quietly, particularly when it springs from emotions that have festered for many years. Chapter 5. The Language of Flowers. The following afternoon found Inspector Craddock seated in Miss Marple's cottage garden, a cup of perfectly brewed tea balanced on his knee. June sunshine filtered through the apple trees, casting dappled shadows across the immaculate lawn, where a tabby cat dozed contentedly. The tranquil scene seemed worlds away from the dark events at Westbrook Manor. You were quite right about the soil on the glove, Miss Marple, the inspector said, accepting a slice of seed cake. The laboratory confirms it matches samples from the greenhouse, a special mixture used specifically for the tropical specimens, not the formal gardens. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily as she continued with her knitting. "I suspected as much. You see, Inspector, I've always found that gardening and crime have certain similarities. Both require careful preparation, attention to detail, and knowledge of the right conditions for results." "An interesting analogy," Craddock smiled. "And speaking of preparation, we've been piecing together the events leading up to the garden party. The garden ornaments were indeed moved to create a sightline, just as you suggested. Young Tom, the garden boy, confirms that Mrs. Lacey instructed him to adjust several pieces that morning, though he thought nothing of it at the time." "And the poison?" Miss Marple inquired. "A compound who delivered that particular glass to Charles Westbrook. Witnesses confirm it was Miss Pierce," the inspector replied, "though she claims she simply took a glass from a waiter's tray, not selecting any specific one." "Most convenient," murmured Miss Marple. "Yet there is something about Miss Pierce that has been troubling me. After leaving Westbrook Manor yesterday, I paid a visit to Miss Edmonds at the post office. She's an old friend, and as postmistress, she often notices interesting patterns in the village communications." Craddock leaned forward, recognizing the gleam in the elderly lady's eye. "And what did Miss Edmonds observe?" "That for the past year, until quite recently, Miss Pierce sent a letter to South America every fortnight, specifically to Rio de Janeiro. The correspondence ceased approximately 3 months ago." "South America," Craddock repeated thoughtfully, "where Charles Westbrook had been living." "Precisely. And if one considers the timing, the letters stopping 3 months ago, and Charles making his secret visit to Lady Westbrook 3 weeks ago," Miss Marple left the implication hanging. The inspector set down his teacup decisively. "I believe Miss Pierce requires further questioning." 2 hours later, in the somber atmosphere of the library at Westbrook Manor, Miss Pierce sat rigidly in a leather armchair, facing Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple. When confronted with the information about her correspondence, the young woman's composed facade crumbled visibly. "I see there's little point in continuing the deception," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is not Diana Pierce. It is Diana Westbrook. Charles was my husband." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. "We were married in Rio 3 years ago," she continued into the stunned silence. "When Lady Westbrook disinherited Charles, our financial situation became precarious. His business ventures had failed one after another. We conceived a plan. I would secure a position as Lady Westbrook's companion under a false name, assess whether reconciliation might be possible, and prepare the ground for Charles' return." "A most elaborate scheme," Miss Marple observed mildly. "It was Charles's idea," Diana admitted. "He remained in Brazil while I sent regular reports. When I discovered that Lady Westbrook often spoke of Charles with regret rather than bitterness, I suggested he make his approach. The reconciliation was genuine. Lady Westbrook truly welcomed him back. Our plan had succeeded better than we'd hoped." "Which means," Inspector Craddock said slowly, "that you had absolutely no motive to poison your husband. Quite the contrary. His reinstatement as heir would have secured your future as well." "Why would I kill him on the very day our plan was to be fulfilled?" Diana asked, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "I loved Charles, despite his flaws, and now I have nothing, not even my position here, once my deception is known." As they left Diana Westbrook to her grief, Craddock turned to Miss Marple with a perplexed expression. "This complicates matters considerably. Our most obvious suspect now appears to be innocent." "On the contrary, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, "it simplifies matters. For now we know that the person who arranged for that poisoned glass to reach Charles Westbrook must have used Mrs. Diana Westbrook, knowingly or unknowingly, as their instrument." "But who?" Miss Marple's response was interrupted by the arrival of young Tom, the garden boy, cap in hand and looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, ma'am, but there's something I didn't mention before. I didn't think it mattered, but Mrs. Timmins says I should tell you everything." "What is it, Tom?" Craddock asked kindly. "It's about Mrs. Lacey and Dr. Grayson, sir.
I saw them together in the greenhouse early on the morning of the garden party. They were examining some plants and talking very serious-like. But when I asked Mrs. Lacey about it later, after what happened, she said I must be mistaken. Dr. Grayson hadn't been in the greenhouse at all. Miss Marple and the inspector exchanged glances. "Thank you, Tom," Miss Marple said gently. "That information may be very important indeed." As the boy departed, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Mrs. Lacey and Dr. Grayson both denied any interaction before the party. "And both had motives," Miss Marple added. Dr. Grayson stood to lose his inheritance, and Mrs. Lacey faced daily reminders of past humiliation with Charles's return. But separately, perhaps neither had the means to accomplish such a carefully planned murder. Together, however, the inspector began. Together they possessed both botanical knowledge and medical expertise, Miss Marple finished. One to prepare the poison, one to ensure he would be the first to attend the victim, perhaps even to ensure that resuscitation efforts would be ineffective. Inspector Craddock's expression hardened. "Miss Marple, I believe we need to gather all our suspects at Westbrook Manor tomorrow. It's time to lay this case to rest." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple agreed, her mild blue eyes suddenly sharp as steel. "For I believe I can now demonstrate not only how this murder was committed, but by whom, and it did indeed involve two people working in concert, each providing what the other lacked." Chapter 6. The final arrangement. Inspector Craddock had arranged for all the principal figures in the case to be present. Sir Richard sat stiffly by the fireplace, his financial ledgers confiscated by the police. Diana Westbrook, née Pierce, occupied a corner chair, her eyes reddened from weeping. Dr. Grayson maintained his professional composure by the window, and Mrs. Lacey, unusually attired in a navy blue dress rather than her customary gardening clothes, perched uncomfortably on the edge of a brocade settee. Lady Westbrook herself had insisted on attending, despite her frailty, supported by Mrs. Timmins, and appearing alarmingly pale against the cushions of her favourite armchair. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Inspector Craddock, her hands folded in her lap, an unremarkable figure to those who did not know her, merely an elderly village spinster with faded blue eyes and wispy white hair. Yet as she began to speak, her voice carried a gentle authority that commanded attention. "Inspector Craddock has asked me to share certain observations that may help explain the tragic events of the garden party," she began. "I should like to start with what first caught my attention. The curious rearrangement of garden ornaments shortly before Mr. Westbrook's collapse. From her knitting bag, Miss Marple withdrew a carefully sketched map of the Westbrook gardens, which she placed on the small table for all to see. These stone figures, the nymphs, urns, and statuary, were repositioned in what seemed at first a random pattern. But when viewed from above, their arrangement created a perfect sightline between two key locations: the greenhouse and the terrace where Mr. Westbrook was to stand during Lady Westbrook's announcement. Mrs. Lacey's hands tightened in her lap, but her expression remained impassive. "This arrangement," Miss Marple continued, "would allow someone in the greenhouse to know precisely when to, shall we say, take action, even though the terrace itself is not visible from that location." "Most ingenious. Are you suggesting the murder was orchestrated from the greenhouse?" Sir Richard asked incredulously. "I am suggesting that the poison which killed Mr. Westbrook came from the greenhouse," Miss Marple corrected gently. "A rare plant toxin requiring very specific soil conditions, the same distinctive soil found on this discarded glove." Inspector Craddock produced the evidence bag containing the gardening glove. Mrs. Lacey's eyes flickered toward it briefly, before returning to study the pattern on the carpet. "The poison itself requires considerable botanical knowledge to extract and prepare correctly." Miss Marple continued, knowledge that Mrs. Lacey, with her expertise in exotic specimens, certainly possesses. However, knowledge alone is insufficient for murder. One also needs opportunity, and, most importantly, motive. Miss Marple turned her mild gaze toward Mrs. Lacey. Your connection to Charles Westbrook was not merely that of gardener to a family member, was it, Mrs. Lacey? You were once engaged to be married. A slight murmur ran through the room. Mrs. Lacey's face remained composed, though a dull flush crept up her neck. That was many years ago, she replied stiffly. A youthful mistake, long forgotten. Not forgotten, I think, Miss Marple said kindly, merely buried, like a dormant bulb waiting for the right conditions to flower again. Charles Westbrook abandoned you for a wealthier prospect who could finance his ambitions abroad. A humiliating experience for any woman, particularly one with your pride. If you're suggesting I harbored a 20-year grudge sufficient to commit murder, Mrs. Lacey began. I'm suggesting nothing of the sort, Miss Marple interrupted. Old wounds alone rarely lead to murder. It's when they combine with fresh threats that danger arises. Charles Westbrook's return meant he would become master of Westbrook Manor, and thus your employer. The man who had once broken your heart would now hold power over your livelihood and your beloved gardens. Lady Westbrook stirred. Margaret, she addressed Mrs. Lacey by her Christian name, her voice faint but clear. Is this true? You never spoke of knowing Charles before Mrs. Lacey could respond, Miss Marple continued, but botanical knowledge and personal motive, even with opportunity, still presented practical challenges. How to ensure the poison reached only Charles Westbrook? How to administer it at precisely the right moment? How to be certain medical help would not arrive too quickly? This required a partner, someone with complementary knowledge and motives. Her gaze shifted to Dr. Grayson, who stiffened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Grayson stood to lose significantly with Charles Westbrook's return. As a beneficiary in Lady Westbrook's original will, a provision that would have been nullified by the new document Mr. Hadley brought to the garden party, he faced the prospect of financial loss. But perhaps more concerning was the possibility that Charles, upon assuming control of the family finances, might discover certain irregularities in the medical accounts. This is preposterous, Dr. Grayson said coldly. I am a respected physician who has been systematically overcharging Lady Westbrook for treatments and medications for years, Inspector Craddock interjected. Our financial investigators have confirmed it. Quite an elaborate scheme of embezzlement, Doctor. The perfect conspiracy, Miss Marple said quietly. Mrs. Lacey, with her botanical knowledge, prepared the poison in the greenhouse, while Dr. Grayson ensured he would be the first medical responder, and perhaps that his response would be deliberately inadequate. The garden ornaments allowed Mrs. Lacey to signal when the poisoned champagne glass was ready. But how was the glass delivered to Charles specifically? Diana Westbrook asked, her voice trembling. That, I'm afraid, is where you were unwittingly used, Mrs. Westbrook, Miss Marple explained gently. Dr. Grayson, observing your attentiveness to your husband throughout the party, directed you toward taking that specific glass, the one that had been prepared and positioned by Mrs. Lacey. You became their innocent instrument. Diana's face drained of color as the implication struck her. I handed Charles his death, unknowingly, Inspector Craddock assured her quickly. Dr. Grayson stood suddenly, his professional demeanor cracking. This is all conjecture. You have no proof beyond a gardening glove and some rearranged statues. We have considerably more than that, Doctor, Inspector Craddock replied. Soil samples matching the greenhouse mixture found in your motor car, trace elements of the same toxin discovered in a vial in your medical bag, and most damningly, a record of your nighttime visits to Mrs. Lacey's cottage over the past year, observed by several villagers. At this last revelation, Mrs. Lacey's composure finally broke. James and I have been close for some time, she admitted, her voice barely audible. When Charles returned, James was concerned about his position. The plan was his idea, though I provided the means. Margaret, Dr. Grayson exclaimed sharply. Don't say another word. It's too late, James, she replied, a bitter smile twisting her lips. Just as you betrayed me 20 years ago, Charles. History repeats itself, it seems. The room fell silent as the full impact of her words registered. Then Dr. Grayson made a sudden move toward the door, only to find his path blocked by the uniformed constable who had been waiting in the hallway. Dr. James Grayson. Mrs. Margaret Lacey, Inspector Craddock said formally, I am arresting you both on the charge of murdering Charles Westbrook. As the grim formalities proceeded and the conspirators were led away, Lady Westbrook turned to Diana with unexpected compassion. So you are Charles's widow, she said softly. He spoke of you with great affection, though he never mentioned your name. Perhaps there is still a place for you at Westbrook Manor. The Westbrook name should continue after all. Later, as Miss Marple prepared to depart, she paused on the terrace overlooking the gardens that had witnessed such dark events. The stone ornaments had been returned to their original positions, the police tape removed, and superficially at least, the scene appeared as serene as before the tragedy. A penny for your thoughts, Miss Marple, said Inspector Craddock, joining her. I was reflecting on Lady Westbrook's gesture toward Diana, she replied. Human connections endure, even after terrible betrayals. Rather like gardens themselves, they may be disturbed, even damaged, but with care they can be restored. A philosophical view, the inspector smiled, though I imagine it will be some time before Lady Westbrook hosts another garden party. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though in my experience life continues its patterns, Inspector. The gardens will bloom again next summer, guests will gather. Champagne will flow, only the gardener will have changed. As she made her way down the drive toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the case to her friend Dolly Bantry, who had come to collect her in the motor car. It was the garden ornaments that first alerted me, she explained. Objects intended to beautify and bring joy, perverted into tools for murder. Rather like human passions themselves. Even love, the most beautiful emotion, can transform into something deadly when poisoned by betrayal and resentment. Goodness, Jane, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. You make one quite nervous about one's garden gnomes. Miss Marple smiled at her friend's attempt at levity, but her thoughts remained with the two conspirators, whose shared bitterness had led them to such a dark collaboration. She had seen it before, how the most vibrant flowers could harbor the deadliest poisons, and how human hearts, once damaged, could nurture vengeance with the same care that Mrs. Lacey had once devoted to her exotic plants. The motor car turned onto the high street of St. Mary Mead, returning Miss Marple to the tranquil routine of village life, a place where, despite appearances, she knew that human nature revealed itself just as plainly as in the grand setting of Westbrook Manor. For wherever people gathered, the same passions bloomed, sometimes bearing fruit both sweet and poisonous.